All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to take a look at a United Nations Security Council resolution that just passed calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. It's a pretty short text, and there's some things that I think people are glossing over when looking at this subject. So we're going to look at what it actually says, what it means going forward, and then some reactions around the world. So what we're talking about here is Resolution 2728. It passed on March 25th through the United Nations Security Council with 14 countries voting in favor, none voting against or vetoing, and then the United States abstained. This is the first resolution related to the war in Gaza that the United Nations Security Council has passed since October 7th. There have been some measures that have moved through the UN General Assembly, which is just every nation that's a member of the United Nations gets to vote. The reason that nothing has moved through the Security Council is vetoes. So the United States has vetoed 2, maybe 3 resolutions. China and Russia vetoed one just last week, a U.S. resolution that was put forward. But this one actually passed, and it's short. So it's worth running through what it actually says. It says, quote, acknowledging the ongoing diplomatic efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States aimed at reaching a cessation of hostilities, releasing the hostages, and increasing the provision and distribution of humanitarian aid. 1. Demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire, and also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs, and further demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law in relation to all persons they detain. 2. Emphasizes the urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance to and reinforce the protection of civilians in the entire Gaza Strip, and reiterates its demand for the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale, in line with humanitarian law, as well as resolutions 2712 and 2720. So there's 2 pieces here I wanted to call out that I think are kind of being missed in a lot of the reporting. First is that the call here is for a ceasefire during the month of Ramadan. Ramadan lasts for about 30 days and is expected to end on April 9th, so like less than 2 weeks away. Now, on or about April 9th. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe somebody can educate me here. I'm interested in learning this, but I'm not entirely clear why the dates of Ramadan aren't known, like the start and end point. Like I remember this in Afghanistan. We'd be trying to work with the ANA, Afghan National Army, and we'd look at Ramadan and ask when it started and be like, yeah, Wednesday or Tuesday maybe. Could be Monday or even Friday. And like even in the middle of Ramadan, it wasn't clear the date that it would end. Like we're talking about 2 weeks away from now. I don't understand why we don't know like the date that it's going to end. So I'm interested in learning that. Somebody, please, I'll check out the comments. Let me know why that is. Either way, assuming Ramadan ends on or about April 9th, you're talking about less than 2 weeks of a ceasefire if an agreement was reached today. And it doesn't look any closer today, despite this Security Council resolution, than it was before this thing passed. So this is the UN Security Council stepping in and saying, figure it out. But when we get down to the nuts and bolts of the negotiations, and we'll talk about that in a second, it doesn't look like Hamas and Israel are close at all. So one of the other things that I wanted to call out here is the U.S. text last week that they put forward was vetoed by China and Russia. And what that text said was that they determined the imperative of an immediate and sustained ceasefire, whereas this text demands a ceasefire. So that's where the hangups end up being with a lot of these Security Council resolutions. Little, one word at a time is the difference whether or not it passes or is entirely vetoed. In fact, the reason that the United States did not veto, but instead abstained from this one, is they were able to change out the language at the beginning, calling for a ceasefire and a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. That was the term the United States wanted, lasting. So an argument against that is that it's incredibly vague. What does lasting mean? It sounds like Russia at least said that they wanted permanent ceasefire in there. That changing of the words allowed the United States enough flexibility to abstain from this vote rather than veto it. So in looking at what comes next, unfortunately, it's pretty vague. It's kind of the nature of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, international relations, all of this. So it's not entirely clear that Israel is much changed by this resolution or how seriously they view it, maybe is the way I'd put it. Their foreign minister, after this resolution passed, said, quote, "The state of Israel will not cease fire. We will destroy Hamas and continue to fight until the last of the hostages returns home. Now, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said that Washington fully supported some of the critical objectives in this non-binding resolution. And that was kind of echoed by U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, who referred to this also as a non-binding resolution, which is kind of true, also kind of not. The challenge here is, and in fact, I think the deputy UN spokesperson Farhan Haq nailed this, explained this in the best way possible, saying, quote, all the resolutions of the Security Council are international law. So to that extent, they are as binding as international law is. Ultimately, however, implementation is a question of international will. I think that sums it up well. It is binding so long as somebody's willing to enforce it, which raises the question, what does enforcement look like in this case? So the United Nations Security Council does have the ability to impose sanctions and authorize military force to maintain or restore international peace and security. So in this case, if the UN Security Council said Israel and Hamas are not adhering to this resolution that we called for an immediate ceasefire during the month of Ramadan, technically the UN Security Council could authorize force, could authorize military personnel to move in there and force a ceasefire between the two sides. I'll put the odds on that one at 0. There's no chance that's going to happen. But either way, any action taken by the United Nations and the UN Security Council to enforce these resolutions, if you will, via the United Nations would require a resolution. So to pass, of course, a resolution from the Security Council needs at least 9 votes in favor and no vetoes by the United States, Russia, China, France, or Britain. And we've got, under 2 weeks. Because again, this resolution calls for a ceasefire during Ramadan. Ramadan ends in about 2 weeks. So the idea that, I don't think that's on the table right now would be the best way to put it. It's worth addressing because you're talking about the mechanisms of enforcing a Security Council resolution. But realistically, when we're talking about the likelihood of that happening at baseline and then on a shortened window, 10, 12 days before this is over, just again, I feel like it's at least worth bringing up. So in looking at how this has been received so far, I think it's safe to say it was not received well in Israel. They were not super happy with this. In fact, in protest, Israel canceled a planned visit by an Israeli delegation to Washington where they were set to discuss the possibility of a military operation in the southern Gaza city of Rafah, which has been a major sticking point between the U.S. and Israel as of late. This was something where we started to see a little progress between the two. Generally speaking, the United States was advising against going into Rafah. Israel said we're going in because that's where the remainder of Hamas is. We can't finish the job if we leave them there. And they finally reached this middle ground where they were going to come together and kind of talk through what some other plans might be. And Israel backed out of that. However, at the same time, White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby told reporters on Monday, quote, our vote does not, and I repeat, does not represent a shift in our policy. And I think he's right. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. When you look at official U.S. policy towards Israel and this war since October 7th, it is largely unchanged. To pick apart and say that the Biden administration or the government has come down against Israel in any way, shape, or form, outside of this abstention vote, you're talking about harsh language. So I think Kirby's actually pretty accurate, saying that there's really no change in the policy at all. And when looking at this Security Council resolution, you're talking about the nuance of individual words, and we'll see if anything actually comes of that. One of the reasons that we don't know if anything is actually going to come from this Security Council resolution is there's still major sticking points between the two sides when it comes to hashing this whole thing out, talking it out, if you will. So what we've seen in the last couple of days since this Security Council resolution passed is that both sides blamed each other for lack of progress in the ongoing negotiations. The negotiations are kind of continuous at this point. They have moderators, mediators, ongoing Israeli delegations, Hamas delegations. And just in the last couple of days, Israel has said, look, Hamas rejected everything. They're digging in. We can't make any progress. And Hamas has said, look, Israel's rejecting everything. They're digging in. We can't make any progress. So you're hearing the same thing from both sides. The major sticking point, if we had to sum it up, is that Hamas wants Israel out of Gaza entirely. So Hamas is looking at this saying, yeah, we'll get back the hostages as soon as Israel leaves Gaza entirely and just walks away. And then from Israel's side, their major component of this entire war is that they are going to either destroy or eliminate Hamas's ability to pose a significant threat to Israel in the future. So you can't do that. If Israel leaves Hamas as they sit today and leaves their key leaders in power and leaves a significant portion of their fighters still operating down in Rafah, the war, in a sense, was for nothing. So that's kind of the major sticking point right now between Israel and Hamas. There's a lot of nuance to those negotiations, and I don't want to make it seem like it's that simple, but even that alone, it's hard to see where they're going to come to a middle ground on that point because they're kind of digging in on that aspect. But either way, all of that nuance and details aside, the passing of this UN Security Council resolution is a pretty notable step. Again, it's relatively short lifespan here, talking about a ceasefire by the end of Ramadan. So this debate is going to continue, right? This is not the end all be all of Security Council resolutions. They're going to have to come back to this and adjust that text and put forward something, again, likely here in a couple weeks. But either way, I thought it was worth running through kind of what that text outlines, what it calls for, what it doesn't call for, and how it's so far been received by both sides. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, linked in the description below. Substack's like a mix of a newsletter and a website. We just put out a great article last week. I really liked it, talking about kind of some history around ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan Province, explaining who they are, where they came from, their affiliations, why they would attack Russia, and who they might attack in the future. So if you're following along with what's going on in Moscow right now, that could be a piece of interest. It's free. Again, linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.